Welcome to the Living Springs Q&A podcast, where your questions are answered live every week by the pastors of Living Springs. Thanks for tuning in.
Good day, everybody. Welcome to our Q&A podcast. We are live and rolling. So I heard that YouTube is up and going, so that's good.
Yeah, we've had an issue where it was like connecting late, so you'd miss the first 30 seconds or minute. But Keelan's on it, has it fixed up.
So if you're watching on YouTube.
Now, if only anybody is there.
If only anybody is there. Well, it's unfortunately also affecting the recording. If people went to watch it after, it would start midway through a introductory conversation. So
yes, it did.
Solved.
That was the week that I wasn't on. I jumped on and I missed the... Yeah.
Only on YouTube. If
Interesting.
you watch on Facebook on our app, it's good, but
All right.
there you go.
Well, hopefully we are good and going. We do have some AER, so maybe we can jump into that.
Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations.
Perfect. Live AER. This actually came in last week, but we missed it. So
Yes.
while, Doug, you were speaking, someone said to you, wait, does Doug not believe in evolution then? Isn't there much science to prove the theory of evolution at this point? Or are you arguing similar points down to the semantics?
No, I don't have an opinion on evolution or creation, so I can't say I believe in it. I don't know. I haven't spent any time researching it. It doesn't, like I said last week, I know for you, Kyle, this was a big faith wrestling point.
Yep.
It never was for me. I just am not that concerned about it.
Yep.
And I long ago, like I said last week, relieved myself of the obligation to have an opinion on everything. I think people go, I believe this, I believe that, and people have to believe everything, and people think they have to have an opinion and believe something on everything. And I just go, I'm not that concerned about it.
Fair.
That for me, I go, I shouldn't. I could say I believe in evolution, but I don't. Like, to me, when you say the word I believe in something, there's got to be some weight behind that. There's got to be some value, right? If we just say I believe in this, I believe in that, then there's not anything. Then when we say I believe in Jesus, what does that mean, right? Like, and so when I say I believe in something, I think those words should matter.
Yep.
And I think those words should mean something. And so I believe in Jesus. And how the earth got here, I don't know. And I'm not that worried about it. And I'm not debating the science in any way. I don't want people to think that I'm like here being like, oh, the scientists know nothing. There's a lot of brilliant people who spend a lot of time examining a lot of things and pondering a lot of things, and I'm thankful for science. I quite enjoy learning about where science, what science is discovering, and what we're learning about the universe and everything. One of the most fascinating books that I've read in the last few years was Neil deGrasse Tyson's Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. Love that book. Just really interesting. And if you want to hear, the creation of the universe from a scientific point of view, in a pretty quick way, because it's about a 200 or 220 page book, that covers it. I mean, he covers billions of years in 220 pages. So he's moving along pretty fast. But I don't know. I don't feel like I would do any justice to any position to say I believe in a position when I haven't done the work to, I think, warrant having a real opinion on it.
So neither are you saying you're fundamentally opposed to evolution either, just to clarify, because I think sometimes that's a difference people assume. Well, if you're not for it, you must be against it, and that's not what I hear you saying.
Yes, I would. So I would lean towards it.
Yep.
But I don't believe in it. Like, and that's, and I also, I just look at it, and I do think, like I said last week, that we always feel like we're just on the verge of figuring it all out.
Yep.
And I do think if we could live 200 years from now, what they will look back at us today and be like, oh, those guys were so cute. Those people, they thought they were really close to figuring out, unlike us. And then if you go 200 years in the future, if Jesus doesn't return, they'll look at the people 200 years from now and be like, oh, those people were so cute. That's human nature.
Yep.
And so I don't want anybody thinking that I'm sitting here saying, like, I don't believe in science. I don't agree with science. Yep. I just am not ready to fight that battle.
Totally.
And I don't feel like I have the qualifications to fight that battle. And by removing myself from it and saying, sure, I lean this way, then I can sit and I can just ask questions from any point of view.
Yep.
And I can come up with any crazy thought I want and drive you crazy.
I actually am seeing, before we go on, I've got some other AER. There you go.
Oh, yeah?
They came in as well.
Well, I was just going to say on this one, I definitely grew up in a circle where, probably even most of my friends and family would still be like, if you told them you believed in evolution, they'd be shocked. Like, they'd just be like, that is crazy. Like, you could not believe in that. But I've met lots of people, especially those who have not grown up in church, so what they got taught in school as elementary students and on, that if you told them you believed in a 7-day creation, they'd be shocked. Or you told them that evolution wasn't real, they'd be like, what?
Yep.
And I was telling you last week after we'd been on the podcast that I was doing teaching on youth or preaching at youth events in my youth ministry years. And I'd spent one day just going back and forth on like YouTube videos and articles on on the internet. And it was like, I'd watch one, I'd be like, that is absolutely true. Like, it's 7-day creation. I'd watch the next one, I'm like, that is absolutely true. It's evolution. I'd watch the next one. It's like, no, it's like, it was just like, and whoever, the charismatic or the charm of the speaker or the elegance of the speaker would totally convince you, because sometimes you'd watch one and you're like, well, that's totally bunk.
Because he's not eloquent.
Yeah, because he couldn't just present the information well. So, it's interesting how I even think with our Revelation series, I said this to someone the other day, whoever taught you first and whoever you trusted, as a child or a young person, it's hard to change that thinking or let anybody else convince you of something different.
Yep.
Yes,
Totally.
absolutely. So I'm not debating evolution. I'm not saying evolution is wrong.
Yep.
But I do think that in general, in the 21st century, it wouldn't hurt us as North Americans to embrace a more humble attitude that says I don't need to have an opinion on things that I'm not qualified to have an opinion on.
Fair enough.
I don't think that'd be a bad
That
thing.
is the most controversial thing that's been said on this podcast so far.
Although I will say that last week I got feedback from somebody after, and they said they really appreciated our discussion and it challenged them, and they were always on one side and they were like, okay, maybe you haven't changed my mind.
Right.
But I guess I don't need to judge the people on the other side, which was very cool.
That's the best part.
That's the win of
appreciate
this podcast. That
Exactly. And I'm like, we are called to follow Jesus.
Yep. Keely's right with you. She's commenting on YouTube Live now. I think there's this idea we must have an opinion on everything. It's refreshing just to abstain sometimes. Way to go, Pastor Doug.
Oh, thank you.
That's
Thank you.
good stuff.
I did post the other AER that came in. I was just making sure I had all the questions in and realized, hey, there was actually AER. It was labeled as such recent. So do you see that? Or do you want me to read it off?
Yeah,
Okay.
I got it. So if people were created before Adam and Eve outside of the garden, and Adam and Eve were given the task of bringing a knowledge and relationship with the Father to the outsiders, could the outsiders have been living in sin if they had no knowledge of it?
That's an awesome question.
And we touched on this last week.
Yeah, we did.
And this is where I was asking you questions, not because I was trying to catch you in anything, but just trying to understand your thoughts on this, because I think wherever you land on the creation evolution, you have to understand that
there's holes and issues with all sides.
Yeah, there's a tension there.
Yep.
Unless, only I think if you are a follower of Christ and you're trying to reconcile Genesis. If you're not a follower of Christ, or Jewish, I guess, and you're just like, I don't believe that book at all, then there's no tension there at all, right? But if you're trying to reconcile from either from any part of Judeo-Christian worldview of the origins of the world, there are some points of tension there. And so I did speak to this, so I think that one is directed at you, Kyle.
There you go. I think there are multiple ways, and to be honest, I haven't spent enough time reflecting on these outside questions that I have a spot jumping on with a theme so far that I'm like, I think it would be this. I think the number of ways you could look at it within holding a position of having others outside the garden before Adam and Eve. One, that Genesis A doesn't concern itself with this question. It's more trying to say, how did God's relationship with humans start? And it's not trying to answer all these outside questions, which then drives us crazy sometimes, wondering, what about this? And I just don't think there is an answer to some questions. So that's the cheap answer.
I think that there is an answer. We just can't know it.
That's a better way of putting it. And then two, I would say this is an age-old question, that what happens outside of those, and you address one of the issues and struggles for you of people who we never got to them, to witness to them, to tell them about God. I think this is the exact same question, whether they were pre-Adam and Eve or they were just lacked or missed by the church. I think it's the same question of how does God's mercy apply to those outside. I've even heard in debates, I think hopefully said in jest, but then if knowledge of sin is what then keeps us accountable to it, wouldn't Christians be all for abortion then? Let's get rid of all these babies before they get there so they can't be held accountable. Like making the argument, so again, that's being said in jest and extreme hyperbole, but we can't know the ends and wonder of God's mercy and grace. That if that's the case, that was their call, maybe then, yes, they weren't living in sin and God doesn't hold them to that without Adam and Eve sharing it. But if they were living in sin, we don't know how God would work to reconcile them to himself.
So, and this is where I'm like, it depends where you want to go.
Yep.
Because you could argue that they didn't know and that therefore there was no sin.
Yep.
But somebody could also argue Romans 1 that they are without excuse, because that's what Romans 1 says.
Totally.
And I don't know the heart behind this question. I don't know that somebody's asking this necessarily about God's mercy, but about kind of what you were talking about last week. And so maybe there's a direct correlation there. Maybe there's not. But I mean, it does beg the question: can you live in sin if you don't know it?
Right.
Right?
And this goes back to a long while ago, and that I really got myself in some hot water with you guys, probably Blake especially, of Adam and Eve needing to grow into knowledge of full humanity and full goodness. Where maybe
Here he goes again.
No, I'm not going there. I was going, whether they were sinning or not, they were not walking with God and therefore didn't know what it meant to be living as a flourishing human. And so Adam and Eve's job in relationship to this goes right back to what it means to be an image bearer, is to be a priest, to be a bringer of God's presence in God's way, that at the very least they were not living to the fullest extent of what humanity ought to be, including failure to live that way, which often is missing of the target, which is sin, to not be living into full humanity, whether that be moral failings or not. There was hope that was their goal, to be able to bring it to them. So I don't know.
It's an interesting theological thought, I think, and I think we said this after the podcast last week, for me anyways, because I've been listening to other podcasts and probably leaning towards maybe there was people before Adam and Eve or others outside the garden. But I hadn't really thought of
what.
I know, this is crazy for me to say. I'm just telling you.
This is awesome.
This is a watershed moment. Blake is taking another side. This is 3 times on this podcast that this has happened, and twice within the last few months.
We're making an
Wow.
opinionated man out of him. Yeah.
But the thing I had not considered is where sin came from. Like,
Yeah.
I hadn't even thought of that question until last week when it came up. And I was like, oh, yeah, because if, again, a more literal reading, we believe that Adam and Eve were, convinced by the serpent, and that's where sin started for humanity. But it doesn't answer the question, and I remember even this in theology class, well, where did sin actually start?
Yep.
Because obviously the serpent was crafty and deceitful before that, right? So at what point does sin enter the realm, right?
Yeah.
And that's, you're still asking the same question, whether it's people outside, whether it's Satan himself, where did this come from, right?
I don't think.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna. I would lean towards saying I don't think that's what Genesis is concerning itself with. It's concerning itself with how to be in good relationship with God and live into full humanity. Yeah.
I would also say that I do tend to see we view sin as a thing versus the absence of a thing.
It's like darkness.
Yes,
darkness
exactly.
is not a
right?
thing.
Darkness is not a thing. Darkness
Yep.
is the absence of light. Cold is not a thing.
Yep.
Cold is the absence of heat, which is why there is an absolute zero below which the temperature cannot get.
Yep.
So when we talk about when did sin exist, in a sense, sin doesn't exist, right? If that makes sense. Sin only exists in that we don't do the right thing.
Yep.
And so the potential for sin was always there from eternity past,
Yep.
even before the creation of time, except in the sense that God cannot be tempted. So I guess the potential wasn't necessarily maybe there. I don't know. But I think it's important for us to remember that sin is more the absence of a thing than a thing.
Yep.
Right? And even when we think about sin as, something I do,
Yep.
which it often is, right? So let's say that, Kyle, you're not here, and Blake and I are gossiping.
Yeah.
Right? We think sin is the thing that we do.
Yeah.
But there's a deeper thing that sin is the absence of a love for you that exists outside of your presence, right?
Yep.
So even though it can manifest itself in an action, it's still the action is the result of the vacuum of not doing something.
Yep.
And I think that's where we get into trouble and we struggle with that because we can see the deed.
Yeah.
We're like, no, well, that sin is actually a real thing.
Yeah.
But it is the result of not doing something.
Which is some really helpful terminology back to, and I'm not trying to do a rabbit hole, but back to that whole conversation of Adam and Eve learning. Into
You
full
really want to
humanity.
go there,
No,
don't
I
you?
don't.
You really want to go there.
It just in the same way that there's an absolute zero, though, there's no end to the opposite side of the scale. It's infinite one direction, but not in the other. Like it can go to absolute zero and not get any colder than that, but the level of heat that can be shared can go infinitely beyond the equivalent of absolute zero
Correct.
on the other end, right? And so I think that's where stepping into fullness of humanity was a never-ending pursuit towards full godliness, but sin is only ever a lack. Like it just clicked for me. That's what the new.
That was better said.
There's only so much we can miss. There's an infinite amount of God's grace and mercy to walk into.
All right, so we don't know. Let's move on to the next question.
Awesome.
The question is, could they have been living in sin if they had no knowledge of it? And
Could have.
I guess they could have, or they
Yeah.
could not have.
Yep.
So
Not sure how that all works out.
look at me. I'm going to be Blake and just sit on
Come
the
to
fence.
our podcast for clear answers on
How is it sitting on that fence there, Doug?
Really uncomfortable. Really uncomfortable. Maybe Blake and I should switch seats.
All right, so bringing us all the way now to present day, this question says, do you think modern day church has become a house for the righteous instead of a hospital for the broken? If God came to church, would he like what he was seeing?
I would say it's really hard to answer this question because you make a blanket statement out of something that cannot be made a blanket statement out of. I think there could be more of one than the other, but I think there are both in every situation and in every church. If God came to church, would he like what he was seeing? I think if God came to every church or any church, we'll say if God came to any church, there'd probably be some things that he would like and some things that he wouldn't like. I think of the letters to the churches in the book of Revelation in chapters 2 and 3, which is the part that most of the time gets preached on and the part we skipped over in our Revelation series.
Makes the most sense.
Was that there were some churches where in every church Jesus, I think in almost, no, maybe not Laodicea, but in almost every church Jesus commended something, and in 5 of them he called something out that he didn't like seeing. And so there's both. And so I think that probably in every church there are people who would be self-righteous and that their actions might be an affront to God because they're birthed out of pride and self-righteousness. And I think there are probably people there who genuinely please the heart of God with the offering they bring, that like the widow with the 2 cents. Nobody else might see it as anything valuable at all, right? That person who comes to church who barely sings, but they're just in such a place of brokenness, that might bless God's heart more than the person on stage who's singing so powerfully and sounds so beautiful because God sees the heart. And that's not to say the person on the stage isn't. I'm just saying when Jesus is sitting watching the people putting in the offerings, and we sometimes get this wrong. He doesn't say anybody else did bad. Right? He doesn't say, all the rest of you stink. Like the rest of you are losers, but look at that person. What he says was this person put in more, which acknowledges what everybody else put in, but just recognizes what she gave out of. And so I think that there would probably on any given Sunday in any given church be both of these happening at the same time.
I'll just quickly say, as you say all that, I think I could make that blanket statement, or I could see how someone could think it's a house for the righteous, but not many of us are very righteous sitting in church. Like we're all broken in some way, whether we admit it or not, right?
I think what this is talking about is self-righteousness.
Yes, I agree with that.
I'm thinking of a parable of Jesus where he talks about is a priest or Levite comes in and does the prayer, thank you God that you didn't make me like that man over there, like the other one,
like the tax collector,
and the tax collector who's weeping and broken. I don't think this is a unique and modern day problem. This has been going on pre-church. If Jesus is able to speak to this issue, we like to build up our own self-righteousness. This is, I think, what Paul's talking about when he has language that seems to poo-poo on the law. I think he's mostly speaking about what we had done with the law, how we had made it this checklist of self-righteousness that we could achieve instead of this call. We'll get into all that. But this is an age-old problem pre-church that has happened forever that we like to step into this. And so I can speak to my own inherited culture and the own environment that I live in. There's a temptation universally for all churches to do this. I would look and say if your exposure to church is typically a charismatic, evangelical type leaning, or even just evangelical type leaning, I feel in today's world, the Western evangelical church is leaning into this a little bit more and more.
Into which?
The self-righteousness that we're speaking of, the house for the righteous. In its own day, the Catholic Church has had their own rejuvenation. I know Orthodox Church has gone through ebbs and flows. I don't know those well. I know my inherited culture and where I live and the water that I swim in. And I do see that a lot of our evangelical churches, painting with broad brushes, do have this tendency to try to put on a mask of self-righteousness and don't have a lot of space. We've addressed this. A lot of churches weren't a space for somebody who's struggling and broken. Absolutely, in every church there's going to be a mix of this. Want to affirm that. But culturally, I feel like we have been leaning towards this idea of self-righteousness in a lot of different ways instead of a hospital for the broken.
I would say, interestingly enough, like thinking of myself in this, as you're saying, yes, we grew up in this, or you understand it like this. I think I want, and I realize this is wrong because I'm saying it, but I see people coming in. You know, I'm like, okay, I want my church to be a hospital. So I want broken people to come in. But what I want them to do is get fixed immediately and then become like me, like self-righteous and all the rest. And I have tons of grace for that, right? I'm like, okay, you know, you're really hurting. Like, we're going to pray for you, or we're going to give you Jesus or whatever it is, and you're going to get fixed, and you'd be like everybody else. But someone who is going to be broken and hurting and going to take a long journey, if they even do get, you know, healed or fixed, whatever that is, then I don't have as much grace for that.
Yeah.
And
We want
I
the
don't
cold
have
turkey
time for
testimony.
that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did you just say?
We want the cold turkey testimony. I came to Jesus, I prayed, never touched alcohol again, or within a month
Yes.
I was ready and fixed, and I'm good to go, and now I'm like the rest of you.
Those are wonderful.
They are, and I'm not saying, but we've come to expect them because we've heard them in media and sermons so often. We've come to believe that's the only way God works, and don't have then the patience for the messiness of the pursuit of righteousness in our lives.
Can I? I don't want to fully disagree with what you said.
Okay, you're allowed to partially disagree too.
Well, I'm just trying to decide if I disagree, or if I guess it's easy to say, man, the church has become this, and say a lot of the evangelical churches have become that. But I would say that a lot of the reason for that is on, if we're going to speak to that portion of the church,
Yep.
and I'm not going to say a ratio or a percentage or
Nope.
anything like that, but to acknowledge that there are some.
Yep.
I feel like the churches where that leans
Yep.
probably has more to do with the pastor than the people.
I completely agree.
And it's easy to just be like, man, church. But I just think it's worth saying
Yep,
that
I-
there are churches that are like, man, that's just like, a lot of churches are just a house for the righteous.
Yeah.
But the pastor doesn't. The pastor can act the same way, can just be putting on the same show, and the pastor can preach a certain way, and the pastor can act a certain way that makes it clear that this is a house for the righteous.
Oh yeah, and I would agree with you, and I would then add another, I think, cultural influence where the embedding of politics and church is happening. I think that does affect it, where it's, we've got all the answers to our side. I think this applies to left or right. Look how embracing and caring we are, those bigots over there, or look how righteous we are, and we've figured it out, so we need to, this is how life ought to be, where I think that confidence in our political sphere has bled into the church in some environments. And again, the charismatic evangelical churches, I think, is where that seeped in the most, where our alienating of one side to the other has then allowed us to feel most righteous and make an other out of somebody else, which reinstates then the self-righteousness that we feel.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you, Doug. I think if the leaders of that church, whether that's the pastor or whoever that is,
Yep.
Walks humbly in that, where you make it a place where the sick, or the hurting or whatever that term is, can come, then I don't think you'd have the problem with the self-righteousness, right?
Oh no, you will.
Well, I mean-
you will. Jesus did.
Well, okay.
But you.
But it would be at a lesser degree. Like, it wouldn't be, it would be different.
I think it'll always exist.
Yeah.
The
Oh, for
problem
sure.
with self-righteousness is people.
Yeah.
Right. The problem with the source of every problem in the world, pretty much,
Yeah.
is people.
But I have a harder time justifying
every-
myself if those ahead of me are not justifying themselves. Like, I would probably feel very uncomfortable in that setting.
And that's where you, Doug, you shared a story a couple weeks ago, either on the podcast or in the teaching, of when you were early on pastoring and sharing a personal story, and you got corrected for that. Right? So I think that speaks to exactly what you're saying. No, we got to keep everything looking good so people can follow me as I follow Christ. Because look, we've got it together so they can too, versus following into the leaning into grace.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
right.
don't know that there's anything new happening in the church that hasn't been there for 2,000 years.
Completely. And it all
Right?
comes in ebbs and flows.
Yes. And I think I think it ebbs and flows in maybe each individual church or each region.
Yep.
But right now, there's spots where there's great revival happening in our world.
Yep.
Right now, there's spots where there's great coldness in the church.
Yep.
And it's happening wherever hearts are open to God, God will move.
Yep.
And wherever hearts are closed to God, love will grow cold.
Yep.
I love all you guys that send in questions. They're just good.
They are.
Good questions. There's another one here. I just want to ask, is loving and serving people enough to win people over to Jesus? Many people serve and love without having faith in God. I also know ultimately is the Holy Spirit's work.
I think that we're supposed to do it in Jesus' name. And I think that part of that is acknowledging the reason why we do it. So if we just serve and we never say anything,
Yep.
I think that it's wonderful that people go, look at those nice people, but they don't know why we're doing it. And so I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. Because I don't think that loving and serving people is enough in and of itself,
Right.
because people will just be like, Oh, that's wonderful. So I'll start there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think there's anything we can do that is enough to win people over to Jesus. I think that's something that has already been listed that the Holy Spirit does. I think those are places we can do to start opening doors. I also know in our now, I would say we've arrived in Canada as a post-Christian culture. There's a lot you can do that no matter what we do. Jesus had people reject him. So if Jesus could have people reject him and say, no, thank you, you could do everything in heaven. And that person then has the free will to decide whether they'd like to. And I unfortunately see there's a lot of hardness towards Jesus and his church because of some past issues within our church, within our own culture.
I feel like there's not as much hardness towards Jesus.
There's not. That's our book for book club this month. It's a lot easier to speak about Jesus and how good he is than to try to convince somebody of Christianity. Speaking of Jesus is the book.
Yeah, because I think that most people are, not everybody understands the Christian view of Jesus.
Yep.
But most people have and not everybody has an accurate view of who Jesus was.
Yep.
Right? But I think most people have a pretty positive
Yep.
opinion of Christ.
Yep. That's a pretty common sentiment. I've heard the first one I really clung to hearing him say that and also broke my heart was Marcus Mumford. He talked about like both his parents were pastors.
Can you tell me who that is?
The lead singer for Mumford and Sons.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm old.
I love Jesus. I can't take the church. Something along the line. Kings of Leon was another. All three of their dads.
Was that not also Gandhi?
Yeah, different. Yeah, I guess.
Same
I'm more
idea,
thinking-
and whatever his quote was.
I'm more thinking. Yeah, I love your Jesus. I wish more of his followers looked more like him, or something along those lines. But for these guys in these bands, it was more like a cultural hurt against church, more than a frustration with how they were living it out, or a real hurt and having been let down by it. But yes, there's a lot of people that have an affinity towards Jesus without his church. Yeah,
I think, and I don't want to read into the question if that's not what's being said, but it makes me think of when it says, I just want to ask, is loving and serving people enough to win people over to Jesus? Is that in contrast to preaching and teaching at them? Because that's, one way that we have in the evangelical church been convinced or think that we need to get people to come to Jesus is that if we preach another sermon, then they'll get it, right?
Yeah.
And I would say it's probably all those things. Like, I don't know that a sermon itself or a debate, because a debate for sure probably isn't winning many people to Jesus.
Yeah.
I don't know that a sermon is always the best way. But I would say, as you already said, Doug, like just loving and serving on them isn't going to win them to Jesus either. If you never tell them about Jesus, they're not going to see that, right? Mm-hmm. I think God called us to love, and I think he called us to speak when we need to speak. I think we need to use all the tools in the toolbox to help people see Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So,
Can I throw out a random thought that's been around for a while? When you say win people over to Jesus, I'm not sure that that's what we're supposed to do.
I was about to
I
jump on a similar
was
train.
waiting for you guys to go down that.
And I feel like there's a lot of pressure that's been put on people that we got to win people for Jesus.
Yep.
And that the Christians feel that, and then it moves from me trying to love somebody and draw them into Christ, and me trying to and I don't think anybody, I'm not saying the person who asked this question has this attitude, but I've seen it where it's almost like a scoreboard.
Yep.
Right? And we're trying to win.
Yep.
And I'm like, I'm not sure I'm there. I look at the ministry of Jesus, I look at the early church, and I see this wonderful message that the kingdom has come, and an invitation to, if you want to, become someone who helps spread the kingdom. There's not a lot of pressure on that. Like you think about the Jesus heals the 10 lepers.
Yeah.
And they just go present yourself. They're healed on the way.
Yeah.
9 keep running to go get their life back. 1 comes back to say thank you. Yeah. And Jesus, like, I think about that story all the time, and I'm like, man, if I'm Jesus in that situation, there's a part of me that, if I'm being honest, is like, oh, you're not getting healed, right?
Or I've had this. This is how terrible I am sometimes. I think, man, Jesus didn't that wasn't very good. Like he didn't win them to Jesus, right? Like that wasn't good enough, Jesus, right?
But that's yes. How many times does Jesus heal people, and then just let them go about their life? Yeah. Right. The call. It seems to me this is where I'm going, and I know this has been this thought that's been percolating in my brain for a long time is the result of the Benedict option and some of the other books that I've read. That the call of the church is the call into priesthood.
Yep.
That Jesus takes 12 guys and he's like, hey, okay, you guys want to come follow me? What following me means is that you're going to go be me in the world. You're going to give up your life. You're going to give up everything, and you're going to go spread this kingdom, even at the cost of your life.
Yep.
And we've switched this around from this being a call to come and die for the sake of Christ, so that others, whether they choose to follow Jesus or not, are blessed.
Yep.
Into you better get your life right with Jesus, or you're going to go to hell when you die.
Yep.
And it's backwards, because then we get a bunch of people who come in to the church and go, okay, now why am I here?
Yep.
Right? I think that what we need to understand, and I think what we as Christians need to get, is that if we want to be a follower of Jesus, what that means is that is a call into priesthood. Yep. That is a call, and we don't like that term, because we don't even use priests in evangelical church, right? Yep. We call it a pastor. We think priest, we think Catholic, Anglican, Lutheran, some denomination that I'm not part of. Yep. And so we're like, when I started talking about we're priests, a couple of months ago, I did a for the blessing in our gathering. I talked about we're all priests, and so I want you guys to bless each other. And I could see people when I said you're a priest, and I said turn to somebody near you and say you're a priest, and it was really loud. I said now turn to that person and say I'm a priest too, and that wasn't nearly as loud, because we're not comfortable with that. But that is the message of Jesus. Yep. Is come join the priesthood. Yep. And do good, that others would want to come join the priesthood to do good. Yep. Mm-hmm. And so it's a call not to win someone over to salvation for its own end. Yep. It's a call to come and give up your life for a greater purpose than anything else you can give your life to. Yeah. If that makes sense. Yep. And I've been thinking so much about this, that in the church we've got it so backwards. Yep. And we're like, we got to get people saved. Yeah. And I'm not saying we don't, but I'm just like, man, we've got to understand what we've been saved to before we can invite somebody else into it. Yeah. Because we get a bunch of Christians who come in who are like, you know what, I'm safe, I'm good, I'm here, I've arrived, and maybe I'll let Jesus work in my life and let him. You know, discipleship is this process of spiritually growing, which it is, but it has to turn itself out into priesthood, or there's no end there. Yep. And so the call is a call to, hey, come and die. Yep. Like it literally, like that should be the call that we're making. Yep. And it should be a call like when Jesus is like, count the cost before you come follow me. We don't talk like that anymore. Yep. And then when we do, we qualify it in the sense of only internal requirements for discipleship and only internal disciplines for discipleship, not in the sense of I'm going to intentionally give my life away in service of others, that by doing that, the kingdom will be expanded and people will see this is something great that I can give my life to, not out of obligation and not because I don't want to go to hell when I die, but because I want to be a part of this movement of priests who have given their life to making the world a better place.
Yep, absolutely. The book that comes to mind, you mentioned Benedict option next to that one, Patient Ferment. I know, Blake, you've read that one. Just so good. They're actually opposed to evangelizing. Like, no. Let's work on ourselves. Let's work on living out the kingdom, and the overflow of our lives will then benefit others.
That's almost where I've come to in the last little while from reading some Dallas Willard stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what Jesus is speaking about. Don't worry about the speck in your brother's eye. Worry about the log in your own. Like, let's just simply focus, realizing we've got enough issues internally. But I think that goes back all the way to our conversation about Adam and Eve and people outside the garden. If they had just been faithful to what God had called them to do, to subdue the earth, to bring the garden into expansion, it would have slowly started bumping into these other people outside of it and welcomed them into the fullness. Israel's job, all the blessing they got, was then so that they could welcome and be a blessing to restore all nations. And our call here is to do the exact same. And I think sometimes when we make our purpose of, and I'm not accusing the questioner of this, but I've seen this train of thought live itself out to the extreme. When we go to serving and loving people for the sake of winning them over, our North American concept of effectiveness and productivity then starts asking, all right, what is the most important thing we've got to do to win the most people? And then we ended up, and I'm not knocking just these events, but it ends up being the main and sometimes only way we think we can evangelize is making these big, large events where we can pack a bunch of people into a concert hall to then have a hand up for Jesus at the end and say, look at the hundreds of people we won for Jesus. We served them through this event. And then we go home, and until the next event comes around, we go, well, I'm not sure how to serve Jesus. Versus the fight for justice, for education, for care, for compassion, for benefiting of others that happens in the day-to-day life where we don't see a lot of wins. It's actually faithfulness to the way of the kingdom, and people happen to be benefited from it. It's not towards the end of saving them. And so we take off the efficiency mindset that is so hard to see past in our inherited culture to go, I'm going to live faithfully, not necessarily only for the sake of effectiveness and productivity.
Yeah, we in the small group that I'm part of have been looking at Ephesians, and we've just gone through Ephesians 1, and we're not even through Ephesians 2 yet.
Yeah.
And I know you're speaking on Ephesians
All weekend, this coming weekend.
this
at a
next
retreat,
week.
yeah.
And I just think that's it. Like when Paul's talking about this just enormous layer upon layer blessing and goodness of following Christ, it has nothing to do with, like, he's not saying, and you get to go to heaven or you get a free get out of hell card. Like, that's never mentioned. Yeah. It's just this deepening and deepening knowledge and understanding and relationship with Jesus and God, right? And then also then adds in, and there's work for you to do, right? All this prepares you for this work that we're all talking about at the table right now. This, I think, I love Jesus so much that I want to share that with somebody, right? And all I want them to know is what I'm experiencing, what I know, right?
And through the work is one of the ways that we are transformed as well.
Totally,
right? It's all together.
Well, Paul,
Go ahead.
Paul says in Ephesians 1 that we would do these good works to testify to the spirits and to the principalities of the goodness of God. Like we are only behaving to show off God's goodness, not to win people over. And he flips the whole script after doing this whole cosmic view in Ephesians 1, 2, and 3, how the whole cosmos has been changed by this. Then he flips it in 4:1. So walk, which is a slow, worthy through humility, gentleness, patience, and putting up with one another. That's how he sums it up when he flips that script. It's this slowness. In Thessalonians, he says that we should aim to live quiet and simple lives. Not loud, profound, and winning a bunch of people. Quiet and simple lives is the faithfulness that we get called to in both Ephesians and in Thessalonians.
In your preparation for this weekend, have you read Sit, Walk, Stand by Watchman Nee?
No.
It's fantastic.
I'll have to add that
It
to
is
one more
all it is all Ephesians.
Ephesians 2.
It's his Ephesians.
Oh, okay.
It's his book on Ephesians.
Okay.
And basically what he talks about is the first part is all you were seated.
Yep.
And then he talks about walk.
Yep.
And then in Ephesians 6, stand.
Okay.
And so that's where he gets sit, walk, stand. And if we're not seated with Christ, we can neither walk nor stand.
Right.
And we want to run right to the second part.
Yep.
Yeah,
Right?
definitely.
But he talks about how like 3 chapters are on what it means to be seated.
Yeah.
And then 2 on what it means to walk after that, and 1 on stand.
Yeah.
Like you have to get this. But you can't just be seated and not do anything with it.
I'll have to sneak that in. I read Tim Gombas's The Drama of Ephesians, Dallas Willard's new, or not Dallas, why can't I think of his name? Daryl Johnson's new one on Ephesians. I read another couple just straight commentaries on it, and Eugene Peterson's Practice Resurrection, which is his book on Ephesians, well, primarily on Ephesians. But so I'll have to add that to the list.
It's a really good book.
Yeah.
But I think what Dallas Willard said when he said, we don't need to try to get more people into heaven.
Yep.
Our aim should be to get more of heaven into people.
Yeah, love it.
Totally.
So,
All right. Ready to move on?
Yeah.
All right. Ready to move on? 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 All
I have nothing more on this one. I'm just reading. Sorry.
Okay, so next question says, wondering if you have any suggestions for women inside the church at Living Springs, but don't feel welcomed by women's ministry, or who don't feel welcomed by women's ministry. I assume.
Well, my first thought to this would be, I don't know your story, and I'm not saying that I understand your story or where you're at, but I'll just speak on behalf of my wife, who oversees women's ministry, and her heart would be that every person would feel welcomed by the women's ministry. I know that's the goal, not only of Lorley, but of the leadership team. So if you had some sort of experience, if you wanted to talk to Lorley about it, I think Lorley would love to hear what it is that happened, or if you want to give it another try, I think that Lorley would love to try to give it another try. If you try to give it another whirl, I know where their heart is, and I will just say if something happened and you didn't feel welcomed, then I do apologize to you for that. Yeah. Like that is really not the heart behind that ministry and the people who serve in it in leadership.
I'll echo that. Like, sorry that you felt disconnected or not welcomed. As has already been said, most problems are with people. And so we can understand there's never going to be a ministry without issue. So to say whatever grouping you could fit it in Living Springs, there will be moments where we bump up against one another. And so I'm sorry for that. I have chatted with women historically who haven't connected with the way things have been done in women's ministry, just simply out of maybe style of things that go on. That just hasn't been the spot where they've connected. And so my other side encouragement would be, I'm really sorry. I wish it weren't so, but I don't think we're going to ever get a universal brush that can fit everybody. That I would say, don't give up hope on connecting to the life of the church. If you're not able to then see some reconciliation or have that conversation. And I know just sometimes hurt relationships make that a difficult spot to go. That I hope we could help you find a space to be connected and flourishing in relationship within the community of Living Springs. But yeah.
And we have some new things that we're working on that are going to be announced in the next few weeks that are going to be more opportunities for connection, which it sounds like this person really wants. Yeah. And so keep your ears open for some of the things that are going to be announced in the next little bit, because we want every person to be able to be connected somewhere.
Yep. Totally.
Absolutely.
I like it. All right. I don't have anything to add to that. I think you guys did well. Next question. How do you feel about the increased use of popular psychology topics within modern preaching? Do you feel it is beginning to replace traditional biblical teachings?
I don't know if we have enough time to answer this question. I have a lot to say on this question.
Okay.
I absolutely. I think that. How do I feel about it? I think that. How do I not? We got like 12 minutes left.
Do you want to hang on to this question and just move on to the next one, and we'll come back to it next week for our first one?
Just drop that little teaser for next week.
Well, I think maybe. Then if next week we answer in 11 minutes, people are like, "What's the big deal?" My brain goes in 100 different directions with this one.
I would feel the same. So I might jump with Blake and let's defer for next week. So we've hit a teaser.
All right. I'm really curious as to what you guys are saying, because I thought I could do that in 10 minutes, but
I've got lots of thoughts.
There's just that question. I think that's a really good question.
Yep.
And I think that it speaks to a lot of. It speaks to a lot of
rabbit holes
that
we could go down and probably would.
So,
all right. Let's jump to the next question that is specifically for you, Doug.
All right.
Hi, Pastor Doug. I have been following your Unveiling Revelation series online. I was wondering where you find your information on the book of Revelation.
Okay, so commentaries.
I know it's addressed to you, but I might jump in alongside you at the same time. But
well, to specifically answer the question, okay, let me just back up and take like a wider view before I answer this question. I grew up in a church where the traditional teaching that I think a lot of evangelicals have about Revelation was what was given, and it was given frequently.
Yep.
And it was always given in the context of current events.
Yep.
And as a result of that, when the current events changed, interpretation of the Bible changed. Yep. And as a kid, it caused a lot of fear. As I got older, I started to just be like, okay, I'm skeptical about all of this. I was not yet in Bible college when I was like, I don't believe when you tell me that an angel appears in someone's car and says Jesus is coming back soon and then disappears.
Enough of those moving the goalposts. You're like, wait a second.
Yes, I don't believe that the government has a bunch of checks with you have to have 666 on your forehead or your hand or you can't cash this check. I'm done with all of it. Then I went to Bible college, and at Bible college you start to learn hermeneutics and things like exegesis, principles of interpreting the Bible and how to read it right. And one of the key things that you learn in how to exegete the Bible is you have to understand what it meant and how it was interpreted and how it was received in its original context to get the principle that applies to us.
Yep.
And we do that with 65 books of the Bible, and then we come to the book of Revelation, and we throw all of these principles out in the garbage. And we go, no, this is totally different.
Yeah.
Now, I get that John says that in Revelation 1 that this is a prophecy, so we could approach that. But there's a whole bunch of the Old Testament that is prophetic literature, some of which is hard to read, that we would still say the same thing. So I came to this place where I was just like, I love the book of Revelation. I can remember reading it for myself and being like, man, this is where, like, I can remember the moment when I first read it and going, all the worship songs we sing at church are plagiarized because they're all from the book of Revelation.
A lot of them are, yeah.
Now, I'm jokingly say plagiarized because there's no copyright on the Bible. But they were taking all, and that was not the first time I read Revelation what to expect.
Yeah.
And how much it focused on Jesus. There was a lot I didn't understand.
Yep.
But there was a whole bunch that I was like, man, this is not what I expected.
Yeah.
And when I read it for myself, I was like, if somebody hadn't already said to me, this means this, and this, and this, and this, and this means this, I don't know that I would have thought that.
Yep.
So I go to Bible college, and I start learning all these principles that I'm like, well, why don't we apply it to this book that we apply to every other book of the Bible? And then I just kind of, for a long time, was silent on Revelation. I didn't preach on Revelation, but I still enjoyed the book.
Yep.
And over the course of years of reading, and it wasn't always a book on Revelation, but it was often just reading something and they would reference something in Revelation.
Yep.
And how they would explain it, I would go, whoa, that makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
And it follows the biblical principles that I was taught.
Yeah.
And I go, okay, I can see something in that text now that I never really got before, besides just trying to scare me into making sure that I was ready and that I didn't get the mark of the beast.
Yep.
That's
That's a lot of what teaching Revelation Pentecostal
Right?
Circle ended up being.
And I don't know what you're going over to Baptist church.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's the
And
same
so
thing.
Yeah.
I also came to this point where I was like, okay, wait. Like it always makes me laugh that Christians can sometimes be so obsessed with the future when the one we claim to follow said, don't worry about tomorrow.
Yeah.
Tomorrow has enough worries of its own.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's just, and I'm not saying I don't.
Yeah.
I worry about the future regularly. But at least when I do it, I acknowledge that I'm sinning. And that I'm like, Jesus isn't right. I need to deal with this. But we come to the book of Revelation and it's all about the future.
Yep.
When Jesus said, don't worry about the future. And so there was all of these things that were working together for a long time. And anything that any series like this or anything that I've preached that I come out and I feel like I say something unconventional, and I think about some of the It's All Greek to Me series that we did in 2019. Those are the result of years of process in my life, of struggle, of wrestling, of prayer, of Bible study. They don't happen in a night. And so I can't say that I read a book and it changed my mind. What I would say is over the course of years, my heart started to see things that were different than what I'd first been taught.
Yeah.
And I would say the first thing where I find my information on the book of Revelation, the first place is the book of Revelation. And I'm not saying that to be facetiously,
No.
but I really genuinely believe that if we approach the Bible with an open heart, that God will speak to us through the Bible.
Yep.
And that's not going to be easy.
Yep.
And we have to approach it as a student, and we have to approach it as someone who doesn't know what the text already says.
Yep.
And when we do that, and we're willing to sit in a text for a long time and wrestle with the text for a long time and let it do its work. Because I don't want to sound like I'm trying to wrestle. You got to let the Bible wrestle itself through, right? Yeah. Let it divide what it wants to divide and let it do its work. But just sitting and pondering these things, that would be number one, is over time. And then there would be a lot of books that weren't about the book of Revelation that I read over time that I was like, just would have different points. And I couldn't even pick out most of them. Yep. But there would just be different things here and there. But I would say the book of Revelation itself. But then beyond that, I would say Discipleship on the Edge. Daryl Johnson. I would say Reading Revelation Responsibly.
Michael Gorman.
And I would say Reverse Thunder.
Eugene Peterson.
And I would say Her Gates Will Never Be Shut.
Brad Jerzak.
And those are the four that come to mind off the top of my... And the book of Revelation itself, John.
Yeah.
I'll say the author for that one. So that is how... And I understand for people in our church, there's some people who are like, whoa, this is not what I've ever heard on the book of Revelation. And I get that. And I get that can cause people to struggle because, like you said earlier, like the thing we hear first is the thing that always has the most credibility, right? Because we go, well, that's the first thing. That's the drawing on the blank paper, and then you erase, and there's still the outlines there, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's so I get that we're saying some things that challenge. And I will say, and we said this years ago on this podcast before I think we had more than 10 listeners. We were talking about Revelation. Yeah. And I said that it might have eschatological implications. There might be a sense where in the end it does somehow refer to the return of Christ in some of the ways that people say. Yep. But predominantly it's not about how Christ is going to return. Yep. As much as it's about how do we live while we wait for Christ's return.
Yep. Awesome. Those are all the resources specifically I would mention, but I'll give extra credit to as well to the Bible Projects series.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
I should say that because I didn't read that.
Yeah, that's a video, and they do have they did do a whole podcast series on apocalyptic literature, which was excellent, and then that video came out of it. That video is just on their Books of the Bible one, but their whole one on apocalyptic literature was excellent. I'll mention G.K. Beale's a shorter commentary. You don't need to go to his full one. His full one's like 1,400 pages. The shorter one's like 5. But it was one of the number one resources I went to as I've prepared my couple of messages on this series. Those are the only other ones I'll call out specifically outside of the ones that you've mentioned, Doug.
I guess that's a
wrap.
Yeah, I only spoke once in that series. I did predominantly use John's writing from the Bible. It was good.
What?
But yes, as a lot of people have said, I've really enjoyed this series as well. Just seeing how Revelation, like you said, applies to my life today. How do I live in light of understanding that Jesus is coming back? Right.
I don't know where it was that probably what started me on the road that I've gone on was at some point, and this would be a long time ago, hearing somebody say, it's the revelation of Jesus Christ, which are the first 3 words, like we talked about in week 1. Like I'd never even crossed my mind that this is the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Well, I think it's so easy to read over things in Scripture, and we've mentioned it in our opening to our messages and stuff, right? That, again, if you're reading it thinking you already know what it says, or reading it assuming what you're going to get out of it, you're going to miss some things because of that, right? Yeah. So trying to step back, I have tried to do that with a lot of Scripture now in my lifetime, stepping back and going, can I read this with fresh eyes? Can I read it like this is the first time I'm reading it? Yep. Yeah.
And as we mentioned, a knowledge of the Old Testament should also help guard some against those things. Like John is so clearly quoting much of the Old Testament that, myself included, we as modern day Christians are not as familiar with our Old Testament. No. We like to jump to the good stuff, the new stuff, versus John saying everything that's been in the Old Testament as well. That helps then guard against some of these interpretations.
And I would also I think that we need to learn. We all, including myself in this, need to learn better how to read our Bible and let God speak to us. Like we think I read a chapter, I'm good.
Yeah.
Instead of sitting in it and wrestling with it and chewing on it and meditating on it, right? Joshua 1, Psalm 1, we've referenced those passages in the Old Testament. Meditate on the law of the Lord. Chew on this. Think about this. Ponder this. If we would approach Scripture with that sort of humility and hunger, I think we'd be surprised with what God has to teach us from His Word.
One of my favorite verses in the Bible is "Be still and know that I am God," and I think most people can quote that one so simply.
Yes,
and yet probably
who lives it?
Yeah, who does it, right? Who's actually still and knows God, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The last thing I was going to talk about
Yeah.
with this series too, I think reading Revelation and other scripture in wide swaths. Sometimes we limit it down to a chapter or two a day.
Right, yeah.
Read the whole thing once. Like don't try to narrow and reflect on everything all the time, but instead read the whole of the book. And I think that helps bring it out together too. Some of the interpretation issues have been because we've zoomed in too much.
Totally. Yeah. All right, guys, that's all the time we got today. So come on back and learn about psychology and teaching next week.
This has been the Living Springs Q&A podcast. If you have a question you would like answered or would like to learn more, visit us at livingspringsairdrie.com.